Thank you for the organizers. It's a real honor to be before this unique and amazing, prestigious body. And thank you for bringing this question before, because it's a very important one. I want to begin by making clear I stand in solidarity with those struggling for democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law abroad. I have actually been active in my human rights efforts around the world, regardless of the autocratic government's relationships with the United States. What I question is the use of military force, that such blunt autocratic instrument can be successful in the delicate task of defending and developing these principles. I question the assumption that there aren't better non-military alternatives. And I raise concerns about the moral objectives being compromised by power politics. I would argue that it is naive to believe the rhetoric we hear from the leaders of the United States, Britain, and many other Western nations that they actually are committed to these principles in the non-Western world. The most prominent Western defenders of the use of force tend to themselves be strident supporters of dictatorial regimes and occupation armies when they're allied with the West. Even today, under President Biden, 57% of the world's dictatorships receive arms from the United States. As a result, Western nations, particularly the U.S., which has the primary power projection capabilities for military interventions, are in no position to take leadership in this area. Before we start talking about fighting dictatorships, we should stop propping up dictatorships. Before we consider fighting for freedom and democracy, we should stop supporting those who are oppressing it. I have nothing but the greatest respect for our previous speaker and her comrades in Afghanistan. But the U.S. was not, I would disagree, saying it was weakness in standing up for the Taliban for the disaster had happened, but the fact that we supported these drug magnates, these warlords, these ethnic militia, and others, and not Afghan civil society. Indeed, I question whether the Taliban would have come to power in the first place had, during the anti-Soviet war, the United States hadn't sent 80% of its aid to the Hekmatyar faction, the extremists, which later allied with the Taliban. Even in the case of Ukraine, where clearly, I think we'd all agree, we are on the right side, there's some questions, serious questions about U.S. motivation. How can Biden, for example, point out the illegality of a country invading another on false pretenses when, as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he played a major role in authorizing the invasion of Iraq on supposed having weapons of mass destruction? How can Biden say targeting Ukrainian civilians is a war crime while arming Israel and Saudi Arabia and defending their bombing of civilian population centers? How can Biden correctly note that no country can unilaterally change its boundaries or expand its territory by force, while his administration is the only one in the world to have formally recognized Israel's illegal annexation of Syria's Golan region and Morocco's illegal annexation of the entire nation of Western Sahara, both of which were seized by military force in contravention of the United Nations Charter and a series of UN Security Council resolutions. I recall being in the University of Melbourne in a panel with Gareth Evans, who many people see as the intellectual architect of the so-called responsibility to protect. He was defending his critical role in convincing NATO to enter the Libyan civil war in the early phases at a time when less than 500 civilians had been killed by Gaddafi's forces. Well, I have the temerity to point out that as Australian foreign minister, he was a big supporter of the Indonesian government, supporting the arming and training of the Indonesian armed forces, which were responsible for the deaths of over 200,000 East Timorese in the occupation that was still going on at that time. He was even covering up for war crimes. At the close of the panel, he went up and started this expletive-laden tirade, tore off my conference badge, and threatened to punch me in the face. I realized perhaps he had a responsibility to protect his reputation, but I didn't realize it was an Australian rules conference. And similarly, you look at the U.S. and Britain, who are major backers of Egypt, of repressive Gulf monarchies, of other autocratic governments in that region, trying to justify the illegal, unnecessary, and predictably disastrous invasion of Iraq in the name of promoting democracy. Oh, what we've seen the results. This has enabled tyrants and their apologists throughout the region to claim that any support for oppositionists is simply an excuse for hegemony and the destruction of their societies. Indeed, I would go as far as to say that Bush and Blair did for democracy in the Middle East what Stalin and Brezhnev did for socialism in Eastern Europe. No police department in a democracy can get away with enforcing law so selectively, so why should our governments? Now, I am not arguing that a government must be morally pure or without contradictions before acting, nor am I denying that a government can sometimes do the right thing for the wrong reasons. However, Western nations cannot effectively advocate for freedom, democracy, and the rule of law as long as they only do in cases where the government in question does not play along with Western prerogatives. This plays right into the hands of Putin, other autocrats, and their apologists. Not only has it resulted in much of the global South refusing to come out in support of Ukraine, but such selective intervention strengthens rather than weakens the very reactionary nationalistic tendencies that threaten the very principles we claim to uphold. In any case, as we saw in Libya, the use of military force usually makes things worse. Indeed, the empirical data shows that so-called humanitarian intervention on average increases the rate of killing, as the perpetrators feel they have nothing to lose and the armed opposition see themselves as having a blank check and no need to compromise. Take the 1999 NATO intervention in Kosovo. While Serbian counterinsurgency campaign against Kosovar guerrillas was indeed brutal, it was no worse than what the Turks were doing to the Kurds at the same time with Western support and other counterinsurgency operations. The wholesale ethnic cleansing came only after NATO ordered the withdrawal of OSCE monitors and began the bombing. And the terms of the ceasefire agreement pretty much split the difference between the original demands by NATO at the Rambouillet meeting prior to the war and the counteroffer by the Serbian parliament, raising the questions as to whether an agreement could have been negotiated without war. And ironically, the world ignored a decade of nonviolent struggle by Kosovar independence led by Rugova and other moderate democratic nationalists, intervening only after the rise of the violent, corrupt, and chauvinistic Kosovo Liberation Army, which has ruled the nations for most of the period since. The good news, however, is that there are nonviolent alternatives. A study by Freedom House a few years ago showed that of the nearly 70 transitions from authoritarianism to some degree of democracy in recent decades, nearly 3/4 were through democratic civil society groups engaged in strategic nonviolent action. Only 2 cases were through foreign military intervention. It was not NATO that brought down communism in Eastern Europe. It was Polish dock workers, Czech intellectuals, East German church people, Estonian folk singers, and millions of others, ordinary citizens who faced down the tanks with their bare hands. It was not 11 weeks of NATO bombing that brought democracy to Serbia, but a nonviolent student-led movement which mobilized the population against a stolen election. And I know the leaders of Otpor, I've worked with the leaders of Otpor, the bombing set back their cause. They opposed the bombing because it got people to rally around the flag, and that's one of the big dangers of military intervention. The data, yes, go ahead.
Do you not recognize that the Central Intelligence Agency may have had something to do with funding and supporting the Solidarity campaign in Poland?
The foreign aid, the limited aid from Western governments to these opposition groups has had very little impact. There's a study by Erica Chenoweth at Harvard and others have showed, if anything, it's been used as propaganda by the regimes to try to discredit them. Indeed, the Otpor people, in hindsight, wish they had not accepted Western aid because they thought in balance it actually hurt their cause. The data also shows that when dictatorships are overthrown through military force, they become only less than 10% of the time do they evolve into stable democracies within the next 5 years. By contrast, dictatorships overthrown through nonviolent action Not all of them, but a majority are stable democracies in the next 5 years. Military means brings martial values, brings hierarchy, a hierarchical authoritarian structures as militaries are. Nonviolent action by civil society is a more pluralistic kind of thing, a lot more give and take, and it serves as a model of a more democratic society to come. The message that power comes from the barrel of a gun is not a good way to start a democracy, and historic data shows this. In conclusion, the best way we can advance democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law abroad is to stop arming and supporting dictatorships and foreign military occupations, support indigenous, nonviolent pro-democracy struggles, and challenge those who would use these noble ideals as a cover for militarism and imperialism. Thank you.